Hello friends, this video on transport in plants part 5 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So now that we have discussed about the types of diffusion, let us quickly talk about active and passive transport. Now when we talk about transport in terms of this diffusion, basically there are two modes of transport, active transport and passive transport. So first, let us try to define transport in simple words. It is nothing but movement of molecules across plasma membrane. Because when I am talking about the transport inside a plant, as I said, the transport has to happen from on a cell level, from one cell to another. The transport has to happen. So that movement of molecules across the plasma membrane is often known as transport. There are two modes of transport: passive transport and active transport. Now we have discussed about these before also, but now since we are discussing about diffusion in detail, it will be wise to talk about them as well. So now whatever we have spoken so far, simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion, they were all examples of passive transport. So let us see what is a passive transport. So it is the movement of molecules across a membrane, requires no energy from cell. So it is that kind of movement of particles so that there is no energy expenditure or there is no energy input from the cell's end. That is because here the particles are moving from a region of high concentration towards a region of lower concentration. So in passive transport, there is no energy input from the cell. So that is the main catch when we talk about passive transport, and that is why I told whatever types of diffusion we spoke about so far, whether it is simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion, there was no energy input from the cell. So they are all examples of passive transport. Movement occurs along the concentration gradient either by diffusion or osmosis. What is osmosis? That is again a special form of diffusion. We will talk about that a little later. But there also there is no energy input from the cell. Two types of diffusion take place, as we have discussed: simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. In simple diffusion, particles directly move across membrane. Facilitated diffusion, you need transport proteins to help particles move across the membrane. So this was a gist of the passive transport which we have already discussed. So now the question is, what is active transport? So let us see that. Now it is very evident that here some energy input has to be there from the cell. So here movement of molecules across the membrane requires some energy from the cell. So now again the same question would strike your mind, that why is it true only for certain molecules? Why certain molecules would need energy from the cell? That is because here the movement has to happen against the concentration gradient. So that is the most important catch here. Here we are asking the substances or the particles to move from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration. So that will not happen automatically. Let us suppose if you keep a cup of hot coffee on the table and you expect that the coffee becomes hotter when you see it after 1 hour, that is little difficult because heat will flow from high temperature to low temperature. Right? So similar is the case here. So now if you want the particles to forcefully move from region of low concentration to high concentration, then you will have to supply some energy from outside. So who will supply that energy? That energy has to be supplied by the cell. So there are some proteins which help in passive transport, whereas there are some other proteins which help in active transport. So let us suppose this is our cell membrane. So now here this region has low concentration and this region is high concentration, but we still want these particles to move towards this side, so against the concentration gradient. So in this case what will happen? The carrier proteins of cell membrane will act as a pump. As I said, some proteins just acted as transport proteins in case of facilitated diffusion. So they were just carrying the particles from one side to the other side. But here, these proteins which participate in active transport, they act like a pump. Why pump? So that they can pump in some energy which will help the particles to move against the concentration gradient. So what is this energy? This energy is in the form of ATP molecules. So from where do we get this ATP molecules inside the cell? So from where the cell gets energy? Cell produce energy by the process of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration will take place inside each and every cell. During the process of cellular respiration, energy will be produced in the form of ATP molecules. And these ATP molecules will provide the energy required for active transport. So due to this, cells which are capable of active transport usually have more mitochondria in their cells. That is because mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. So mitochondria participate in cellular respiration. They produce ATP molecules. So those cells which participate in active transport, they need a lot of energy, they need a lot of ATP molecules, and ATP molecules are produced by mitochondria, so they generally have more mitochondria. So here ATP provides the energy input from the cell. So this is active transport. So now we talked about three different ways of transport. One is simple diffusion, one is facilitated diffusion, and the third one is active transport. So let us quickly have a comparison of active versus passive transport. Now, when we talk about, let us take the example of that slope. So when I talk about passive transport, there is no energy expense from the cell. There are two ways. Either the particle can move down the concentration gradient on its own, or the particle might need a transport protein or a carrier protein to pass it through the potential gradient. Whereas in active transport, the situation is something like this. Let us suppose if you want a particle to move up the hill. So obviously the particle by itself will not move up the hill. But the particle in this case, the particle in itself was able to move down the hill because it was a slope. So it was able to move on its own. But here the particle on its own can never move up the hill. So it needs something which can carry it. Suppose now here the bottle also cannot help it because the bottle cannot climb the hill. In this case, the bottle was able to come down the hill and it was able to overcome this small break. But here it cannot move up the hill. So you need a special type of protein which acts as a pump, for example a car. So this is basically a vehicle which has some energy because of which it can drive up the hill, and that is how it can carry the particle with itself. So here the car is not only a simple protein like this jar, it also has some energy in it. Because of that energy, it is able to move from low concentration to high concentration. So this is the concept of active transport. So I hope that the concept of facilitated diffusion and active transport is clear to you. Okay, so now let us see where do we actually see the application of active transport when we talk about the transport in plants. So where exactly we see this concept of active transport? Now, as I mentioned before also, that plant needs so many things for its survival, growth and maintenance. It needs water, it needs minerals, it needs carbon, oxygen, so many things. Now, the plants need minerals like nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and they are all present in the soil. So, in the soil you have all nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Now, the concentration of these minerals in the roots is already high because the roots already keeps absorbing these minerals, so their concentration is already high in the roots, but we still want more minerals to get into the roots. So basically we want these minerals to move from region of low concentration to region of high concentration. So how can they move from region of low concentration to high concentration? By active transport, so that more and more minerals can get into the roots. Now let us suppose if active transport does not take place, then what will happen? Since the concentration of minerals is high in the roots, the minerals by default will diffuse out by the process of diffusion. That is, from high to low concentration it will start diffusing out, and the minerals will be lost to the surroundings. So the plants will not be able to get a lot of minerals. So because of active transport, even if the roots already have a lot of minerals, but still the movement of minerals into the roots will keep on occurring. So that is how active transport plays an important role in transport system of plants. So let us have a quick discussion on the different transport processes which we have discussed so far. We discussed three types of processes: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. So simple and facilitated diffusion happens from high to low concentration, that is along the concentration gradient, whereas active transport happens from low to high concentration. For simple diffusion, there is no energy input from the cell because it is a passive transport. Similarly, facilitated diffusion also is a passive transport, but active transport, energy input is required from cell in the form of ATP molecules. In simple diffusion, the particles can move on their own. They do not need any proteins to carry them. But in facilitated diffusion as well as in active transport, you need transport proteins to carry them. They cannot move on their own. In simple diffusion, movement continues till the equilibrium is reached, because there the particles are moving from high to low concentration and they will keep moving until both the concentrations become equal. Whereas in facilitated diffusion, the movement stops as all proteins are used, because here you need proteins to carry the particles. Now as soon as all the proteins have already been used in carrying particles, you don't have any more proteins. So even if you have particles to be moved across the membrane, but you don't have proteins to carry them, so the movement will stop. So similar is the case for active transport, because they are also the movement is dependent on carrier proteins. Simple diffusion is not selective. It is not that some particles are allowed and some particles are not allowed, nothing like that. Whereas facilitated diffusion and active transport are very selective in nature. That means the transport protein or the carrier proteins will carry only specific type of particles and not all particles. So this was a quick comparison between the different transport processes which we have discussed so far. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.